Welcome to Writing the Wrong Way, where we talk about how writing works, how writers work, and why the best writers risk being strange. And I'm here talking to Antonio Michael Downing, who is an author, a broadcaster you might know from CBC's Next Chapter, among other things, and a musician. His musician name or personality is John Orpheus, if you know John Orpheus's work. And then we're going to talk about mostly your writing, Michael, but I wouldn't mind touching on some of the musical things a little bit because I come from a musical background originally. That's how I got into writing. And how I got into writing originally was I grew up in the 90s in the era of grunge. And so, I was living in a small town. I actually lived not far from where you were. I lived in Stratton, Ontario, about 75 kilometers from Sioux Lookout. So right in that same sort of area. Yeah. And I moved there similarly when I was around 10 or 11, when you were level 11. And so when I was growing up, as you know, there's nothing in that area. Like you can't go buy a record at a record store, and so, we would just have these tapes that you tape from other people. So they'd be degraded. And of course, in the era of grunge, it's all, Kurt's mumbling and, Eddie Vedder's, kind of got that weird mumbling drawl. So, and without the lyric sheet, it was really unclear what these people were saying. And until the internet really came around and you could get the lyrics, or, Columbia House came around, you could start ordering CDs or stuff, you just wouldn't know what they were saying. And so I would sit there and try to I was always interested in what they were saying. So, you'd sit there with your tape recorder and playing it, writing it down, what you thought they were saying. And what eventually I realized after I'd been transcribing all these songs, and then later I'd find the lyrics, and I'd realize I had half the lyrics wrong, right? And so effectively I'd written, in some cases, I remember with Pearl Jam's Even Flow, or sorry, the song Oceans, every single word was wrong. But I actually liked some of the stuff that I had accidentally written better than I liked some of the things that they were saying. And so that sort of started me as a writer in a weird sort of way, kind of making these. I started then writing like fake lyrics for the songs, and then I kind of graduated poetry, and that moved me into prose and so on. I'm curious to sort of know how your writing comes out of or connects to that musical development, because my understanding is you were focused on music initially more than writing, and then started to ramp up the writing focus. But is that true, or is that just the public impression? You've always been kind of deep in the writing.
Yeah. First of all, thank you for having me. I'm happy to be here, Jonathan, and talking to another Ontario Northerner and former musician, recovering musician. Um, I love that story about approximating the music, the lyrics, and getting it wrong, but creating a new thing. I feel like that's a microcosm for all creative processes, right? Like the Beatles were trying to cover Black R&B musicians and just weren't good enough to do it. And so they created this whole other thing, which, was, fairly successful. So I feel like all creativity is like that. So from my journey, I was always writing. I started as a kid writing short stories. It starts with my grandmother. So my grandmother taught me how to sing because she was always singing Anglican hymns. And she also taught me how to read when I was like not even 4 years old because her eyes were bad and she needed to read her King James Bible. So I became her eyes and I knew Sesame Street. So she taught me how to spell everything out and she'd tell me what it means, how to pronounce it, etc. So for me, story and song were always one thing. And I'm a journaler. So from the time I was 12, I'm journaling almost every day. I have journals that go right back to when I was 12, 13. And and then as I started to get into music, I very quickly, even before I was that great a musician, I progressed to writing songs because I realized that most people didn't have the language facility that I had. And so for me, I was doing a lot of songwriting and a lot of lyric writing, and I was trying to tell stories in lyrics, but I was also Then I took a degree in English literature. And so while I was reading all this stuff, like everyone else, I was also kind of doing what you're doing with Eddie Vedder's mumbling. Except I knew what they were aiming for. I was just trying to. So when I studied Chaucer, I would try to write like Chaucer. When I studied a Shakespearean sonnet, I would try to write a Shakespearean sonnet. When I studied, William Blake, I would try to, write something as evocative as "Tiger, tiger, burning bright in the forest of the night." I would fail at all of these things, but in failing, just like you're describing failing at capturing Eddie Vedder, in failing, that's how I learned how to write. And so the entire time I was writing, I actually wrote a novel in university, but I didn't know anyone that was publishing books. So I thought, that's not a realistic thing. People don't do that. But I knew a lot of guys that were playing in bands. And so I thought, okay, well, I'll just do that because I actually know people that do it. I kept writing, but my sort of creative career became music for, really for the next 20 years almost.
And then can you talk a bit about Molasses, writing your book Molasses? Maybe first is just explaining the style of that book, and how it is, and then maybe get a bit into kind of what occasions you actually putting that book together.
Yeah, for sure. So the first thing I ever published came out of a friendship with a guy who I call Chachi. His name's Christian Snyder. So if you're from Kitchener-Waterloo area, the Mennonite brothers that founded that city were the Schneider brothers. And that's where Schneider's meats come from. And there are a lot of Schneiders there. But Christian is actually descended from one of those brothers directly, Christian Snyder. He's named after him. So I met him at a party. We had a friend named Anya. She was a model. So, and that's a career that peaks young. So she was our age, but she was traveling the world, and she kind of collected weird little tortured artists. And so we're at this swanky party, way more swanky than our age would allow us to be, and he's over there and he was a painter, and he had these paintings clutching to his chest kind of protectively, and I had a book of poems clutching to my chest protectively because we had both been invited to exhibit and read at the same party. So we became friends, and his father ran a Mennonite printing press. And so at one point we would hang out and he would paint and I would write poetry. And just to show you again that Eddie Vedder, the muddling our models, I was obsessed with Dante. So I wrote a narrative poem in terza rima, but an English version of Dante's rhyme
Wow.
scheme, terza rima, for those that don't know, when I was like in my 20s, just being a nerd. And and he actually, because he would help his dad at the press, he actually went down and they pressed it up. And the poem, he then painted 5 paintings from the poem. And we had a show at a coffee shop where he unveiled the poems while the painting, sorry, while I read the poem to a Spanish guitar player. And so that was the first time I experienced publishing. And then as I went to school and I was playing music, and I started a corporate life at BlackBerry because that's how I paid for my albums and my studio time and stuff. I'm sure you know how the financing prerogatives
Yeah.
of independent musicians. But while I was doing that, Christian took over his dad's printing press and would keep going with the normal business, but he also started a fiction label. And so, of course, because my poem was one of the first things he actually published on his own, he kept bugging me to write something. Please write something. Please write something. Um, I spent about 9 years at BlackBerry, and in 2010, it was great. I got to travel a lot. It funded my music. I got to work from the road. it was really compatible with being in show business, first of all, because I was in sales. So it was really, same deal. You're on stage, you have some lines. Which jacket are you going to wear? Okay. Corporate room, we wear the blazer. On stage, we wear the army jacket was my jacket in those times. So I at one point was had a territory for BlackBerry for small business for AT&T, our main cell phone carrier, and I had the South. So, or as I called them back then, or I like to call them, all the states that voted for slavery is what I called them.
That is
And
the area they gave you.
yeah, so that's the area they gave
Mm.
me. And so I was in New Orleans, Miami Beach, Charlotte, Atlanta, the Panhandle, Tennessee, Kentucky, Memphis, um, all the time. And so I was fascinated by it because, of course, we've all heard a lot of stories about the South. I was fascinated by how the history intersects with the people. And that was a theme I returned to in my recent novel Black Cherokee, which just came out on Simon and Fraser a few months ago, in North America. It's Molasses is almost like a proto version of Black Cherokee. And so all these impressions of the South, like the preaching, the cutting through the landscape, the sound of the bush at night, the history overlapping, the tension between black and white people, the the friendliness of people, which covered up a kind of a of a low key sophistication, or as they say, we talk slow but we think fast, and and all of that I packaged into this really visceral, avant-garde, postmodern world of Molasses, where I tried to fit every idea of every novel I'd had for 10 years into it. Way too many. And so it's a beautiful mess, but the vibe of it is very much this Southern, almost gothic feeling, almost mystical feeling.
Yeah, I come from the avant-garde as a background. And I'm
Mm.
sometimes considered an avant-garde artist, other times I'm considered a horror writer or
Right.
science fiction writer. I'm not super interested in that kind of thing. But where I sort of, I think unlike a lot of people, where I maybe first saw your work was back when you did Molasses, which unfortunately I don't have I've lost my copy of since then. I had lost a bunch of stuff in the move. But
Mm.
it's hard to find now. But
It is hard to find, but we can hook you up. We'll talk.
yeah, oh, definitely. But so it was interesting with Black Cherokee to look at how stylistically it's very different. I mean, you don't have as much of a tie to say what Ondaatje was doing or whatnot, but and it's not messy in that way. I mean, I like the
Mhm.
messiness of that book
Yeah,
because to me
yeah.
that's a real it was a real trend at the time that I think had a lot of power and things to recommend in it. Whereas Black Charity, as you say, it's a more normal book in many respects, but you can see like some real ties to that same sort of approach, particularly with I find the style of it is it's very subtly um, focused around sound. So, your first line that night they made succotash. Succotash has got a great mouth feel as a word. It's got a
Right.
nice specificity to place, and it kind of gets you into a scene in an interesting way. Of course, that whole opening scene focuses around the making succotash. And there's another line in that opening scene which I thought was really interesting, which from the direction of the stove came a sizzling storm is the line, and
Mm.
that onomatopoeia of the sizzling storm, and that how that phrase sounds like the sizzling that would be
Yeah,
coming from the stove.
yeah.
I think that sort of a line is a very subtle kind of way it's the kind of thing that a lot of readers wouldn't necessarily notice, but like somebody who is a writer who's a bit more tuned to the sound of things in that technical way, I think can notice that like that's the sort of the kind of line that a stylist writes.
Hmm. Hmm.
Where, but a lot of
Gotcha.
stylists are not as focused on, let's say, telling a story, uh,
Yeah.
and in the way that you are focused on in a book like Black Cherokee. I'm just sort of curious to know, like between, say, Molasses and Black Cherokee, can you describe a little bit how you think your way of writing has changed and kind of why
Hmm.
it's changed the way it has?
Yeah, well, I think, yeah, there's a lot there. I mean, I think first of all, I'm always concerned with the music, what I call the music of the language. It doesn't matter what I'm doing, and that's my background in music and as a lyricist. So I'm concerned with things like rhythm, dissonance, um, harmony. These things are always sort of, it's almost sketched into my DNA where I don't sometimes don't even think about it a lot, but I understand that what is good needs to actually sound good when it's pronounced in the room. And so I think about, I recently fi finished reading Ulysses, which a lot of, people have started reading Ulysses, but finishing is another story. And what I learned, how I finished it was a friend told me that, hey, Joyce was a singer, which of course we know from, if you read Dubliners, there's always music and singing. And Molly Bloom in Ulysses is a professional singer. Joyce was a singer, and so was his wife. And so they said the key to finishing Ulysses is to read it out loud because he's has a keen ear for the music. And so that's important to me. And I like to establish that early. So when you read the first chapter of Black Cherokee, I mean, you're the first person to point it out, so kudos. And I never volunteer that info unless somebody wants to talk about it. But what I'm trying to do is establish a mood, and most of that establishing the mood is a sound palette. So
Sure.
just like you would do a flavor palette if you were cooking, which is what they're doing, and I'm trying to map flavor palette to sound palette, to thematic palette, and I'm trying to make all of that happen at once so that even though you don't know where we're going, you know where we're going in terms of the notes we're going to use. So if in a musical sense, it's like establishing the key signature, the time signature, and the speed and volume of the piece right from the start. And so how has my writing changed? I think I'm still focused on that. If you talk about intros, if you recall, Molasses starts by me po- pronouncing the syllables and spelling them out phonetically. Molasses and very much the trick that Vladimir Nabokov does at the beginning of Lolita. You'll remember it starts Lolita, three syllables. You drag
Yeah.
the tongue across the palate exactly. And so literally what I did in Molasses is I echoed that by talking about how do we situate the sound in your mouth? And by doing so, we're getting you to sound out the writing because we're now playing in the dimension of what's on the page, but also what you hear when you read what's on the page. And that's a very um yeah, it's a difficult thing to do over 100,000 words. Let's just say that.
Hmm.
But as a writer, I think I'm not happy until I've done that, until I've sounded it out. What's changed is like you say, stylists are sometimes way more concerned with style than the coherence of telling a story. And I came from people like Kathy Acker's Empire of the Senseless um, was a book I was thinking about a lot doing Molasses. And as you said, Ondaatje was a book I was thinking a lot about doing Molasses as well. Now I've moved into a realm of more how that's closer to Joyce where it's kind of like we're still evolving the style of musicality. Let's call it that, even though that's not really a critical term, but maybe it needs to be. So the musicality is still there, but I'm adding a sense of traditional story arc and character development. And
Right.
sometimes there's less musicality because the challenge of doing it over 300 pages is more difficult. But if you go to the musical scene in chapter 17 in Black Cherokee where she goes to church and they're playing music,
Yeah,
that is
the
literally,
synesthesia moments.
yeah. The
Mhm.
synesthesia moment, that is literally me taking you fully into, that's a very molasses moment right there. So it's more like I still have the extreme of style where the style becomes the substance like molasses, but it's happening in very key spots. And then in the other
Right.
spots, I'm telling a more traditional story, but I'm always having a keen ear for how do things sound?
It's interesting that you bring up Joyce because I hadn't really thought about it looking at the book. But it it does sort of make more sense in a descendancy from Dubliners than it does in the way that a lot of reviewers have been talking about it because they've been making the comparison to Morrison, which who really comes out of a line from Falconer, not
Hmm.
Joyce. And
Yes.
when I was reading it, I was kind of like, I don't really understand that comparison stylistically
Yeah.
speaking. I mean, maybe they're just making the comparison for other reasons, but it seems like it is more of a line from Dubliners, isn't it? Like than say
Yeah.
from Faulkner and Morrison. Now,
Yeah, because
so that
if
sort
you
of makes
have an
sense of that to me now.
if you have an American reviewer, I mean, they're just like, okay, you're a black writer writing about the South, Toni
Yeah,
Morrison, right? Which, I love Toni Morrison. I read a lot of Toni Morrison, but also
but
um
it's not the same
it's
approach, though.
it's not the same lineage. You've called it out. The lineage is actually more Joyce than it is Faulkner. Absolutely. And
Right.
I think people are kind of blinded by the subject matter and the setting, and because it's America, we tend to group things together. But if you're actually reading the writing, the lineage is more Joyce and Nabokov, and that's really, I come from more of an English literature background than an American literature background.
Yeah, I mean the comparison, it maybe it's fair on the content level because it is dealing
Yeah,
with issues like the title in and of itself. It's Black Cherokee. A lot of people.
yeah.
One thing you get into very early in the book, you just sort of like note it, um, but it is a sort of larger issue, I guess, in a sense, which is that the Cherokee had slaves. And a lot of people don't know that.
Hmm. Yeah.
And it's something that kind of, plays into the novel. So on the content level, I can, yeah, maybe see the comparison, but I guess I'm always reading
Yeah.
on that stylistic level. So I was kind of,
Yeah.
a bit confused about some of the things that people were saying about the book when I, finally took a look at it. But that
Hmm.
does make a lot of sense. And then I'm curious to know, so when you're talking about these influences in this way, and even before you're talking directly about it, you've been mentioning a bunch of people, trying to rewrite Chaucer when you were younger and things like that. I'm curious because a lot of writers are afraid of being influenced, or they have some idea that they don't want to admit their influences. But
Yeah.
you seem, to more obviously be interested in being influenced in a sort of way. I'm
Yeah.
curious to know about that
Yeah.
because I
Well,
agree that that's the right approach, but a lot of people
I
have this
come
idea that it's not.
well, we come from musical backgrounds, so you can't understand Keith Richards. Keith Richards doesn't hide the fact that he loves Leadbelly and Robert Johnson, right?
Right.
So he actually considers it a great strength to be situated in the lineage of Leadbelly and Robert Johnson. Nabokov considers it a great strength to be situated in the lineage of Tolstoy and Gogol and Lermontov. he considers these the forebearers stylistically of what he does. James Joyce considers it, everyone has forebearers, right? And it actually is a powerful thing to understand. Like for me, I realized very early on that I was being influenced by things I was reading. And so to me, I don't want to just go, okay, well, let me just not think about it and hide it, because then it becomes a subconscious influence. And
Right.
then it might influence you in ways that you don't want it to. So how do you deal with that? Well, we say, well, yes, I do like the way these writers write, and they have impacted me. So let me study, what is it about it that's impacting me? Why do I like it so much? How can I use it or not use it going forward? And so understanding your lineages, and I love the split you're making, because I always think substance and style. So Black Cherokee, substance wise, it's a little girl, black girl growing up in America, is like the bluest eyes. So that's very Toni Morrison. Black Cherokee stylistically, though, is closer to James Joyce. And so depending on what you're watching, it's in a different lineage. But to me, I think understanding what's influencing you, like to say that we're not influenced is a bit naive, because everyone's influenced. You're not inventing writing for the first time. You're not inventing novels for the first time. So you're whatever you're writing, it's because you read it somewhere else.
All these words are in the
So
dictionary, is the thing
yeah,
I like to joke about. I'm like, all your words are in the dictionary, so
yeah,
you've got two approaches. You can, just quit stressing out about it, or you can start making
yeah,
up words, and
yeah,
you can do a bit of both too, especially as a poet.
yeah.
Um, one of the
And
things
so
that's
the more you understand that where it's coming from, the better you can use it. And so that's why I don't fear the lineages. I embrace them, but I also want to understand them so I can choose how be intentional about how I want them to impact what I'm doing.
well, and in fact, I would go so far as to say that one of the things that's notable about Black Cherokee is because you're sort of combining the content influence of Morrison and the, say, stylistic influence of Joyce, you've actually broken away from the problem with a lot of novels like this, which is they're too much pulling from Morrison.
Yes,
Do you know what I mean?
yes.
And
Yeah.
so while being in that, putting yourself in that tradition on a certain level, you're actually expanding the
Yeah.
realm a little bit, you know.
Yeah. Well, it's controversial because, there's a whole realm of black writers where there are certain writers that are sort of lifted up and deified. Baldwin is one, Morrison is
Yeah.
another. And and people kind of say, well, there's a big critique like, well, why are you reading Old Dead White Men? Because that's we should be reading more Morrison. But and you know what? I love those books of those black writers, but I also note that Toni Morrison loved Faulkner and loved Moby Dick and she read all these people that read her now are saying, well, don't read them. And I always think that's wrongheaded because um if I were an architect and I wanted to build a great building for a particular purpose, for let's say for Black children, for example, I want to build a new way to build a school. I wouldn't just study Black architects. I would study all the people that have done it, and I would become good with it, and then I would use all that skill. And so I liken it to that. I think it's a wrong-headed move, and I think it results in bad art. Like after a while, everybody sounds like bad Toni Morrison, and like kind of like every band sounded like bad Pearl Jam for a while
Yeah.
now too, right?
Yes, but at the same time, here and there, somebody will come out, like Stone Temple Pilots came out. Yeah, at the time,
Right.
everyone's like, "Oh, this is just a bad Pearl Jam," but then they didn't. But except you're doing these things that Pearl Jam would never do. But it
Yeah.
turns out those are the things that are interesting, right? They had a bit
Right.
more
Right.
swing in it. They had this kind of weird. In any case, I think that ultimately you get in that's the correct path in a certain sense, like, yeah, you have someone like Morrison come along. They're pulling from these, other writers, but, moving into a different content direction or taking a different
Yeah.
approach, but
Yeah.
not necessarily an inventor in style. And then,
Yeah.
you have somebody coming after her who's, going to, again, let's just pull in this lineage, but then pull in these other, styles that, and it
Right.
started to kind of alter things. And again, to me, that's where you start to get expansion of the, let's call it a genre, which it isn't exactly,
Right.
but you start to get expansion of
Yeah.
something like the genre or the tradition. When I teach, it makes me think of, when I do my English literature classes, my intro English classes, I always teach the Chameleonaire song "Hip Hop Police." I don't know if you
Right.
know that song, but it has, but it's very specifically a song that has a bunch of literary techniques in it, But one of the things that he's doing in that song, obviously, that rappers will often do, is they'll sort of insert themselves into a lineage of, other rappers, and then sort
Hmm.
of start to establish an argument as to why they're the one, the product of this lineage, and two, the culmination of it. There's all sorts of weird,
Yeah.
interesting
Yeah. Yeah.
technical things that they're doing. But part of it is about claiming a tradition.
Yeah.
And then part of it's about, I'm taking the tradition in a new place, and that's what makes me
Hmm.
the greatest, or what have you. Um,
Yeah.
Something else that I just want to kind of talk about with the Black Cherokee is, again, just because of where I grew up not too far from Sioux Lookout, and I know that area well. And I similarly came to it around the same age. And it's an age where you don't necessarily know as much as you think, and you think, and it's very shocking to move from one place to another. And I think some of the things that people, uh, like, I think sometimes people will read your bio or something, and they'll see something like, oh, you know, you came to Sioux Lookout, you were, basically the only Black person in Sioux Lookout. And people think that's an exaggeration. That's not an exaggeration. That's what that area is. I literally, from the time I moved there to the time I moved away, I never saw a Black person except on television.
Wow.
And so there, and I had met people before, but like, that's the kind of area it is. And there's a lot of oddness to the area as a result. And at the same time, as you point out, it is a place where the indigenous population is quite high. And, as you say in the book, it taught me the first thing I learned about North America. It doesn't like indigenous people. Soon
Yeah.
after I learned that it also doesn't value Black people. Um, I'm curious to know a little bit about, uh, you know, that experience. I know you talked about this in your other book, your memoirs to some degree, but
Saga boy. Yeah. Hmm.
yeah, Saga Boy. But I'm curious to know, like, what was the moment where you realized that? Do you have like a memory of the moment, or is it just sort of a pattern you noticed, or was there like a moment?
I think there's a bunch of moments, and I write about this a lot in Saga Boy in my memoir, which I mean, which is also a really important stylistic development step in the process from molasses to Black Cherokee. But um, that particular thing, it was shocking because where I grew up in Trinidad, we saw cowboys and Indian movies, and we thought all those people were gone. And then to show up and realize they're not just gone, they're here. They got their own language, they got their own way of being. They're here in modern times, and also going to a powwow, which was really powerful for me because I'm coming from Trinidad. And I guess the big things were the parallels. In Trinidad, we have we have carnival, which is kind of where we call it playing mass. So we dress up and there's drums and we dance in the street. And when I went to a powwow, I saw like what felt to me as the same energy. And so that was really shocking. And my Aunt Joan at the time, she lived, is she, the reason I was the only Black kid in Sioux Lookout. There were probably one or two, um, but not many. Um, I was because she worked on the indigenous reservations way up where there's no roads, where you got to fly in on the little five-seater planes. And so I had a really intimate experience with indigenous folks, and I immediately felt an affinity for what they were doing because of the powwow energy and the carnival energy, which is the most indicative Trinidadian thing. Um, but also because the only white person I knew when I was a kid was Queen Elizabeth, because we in this one room rural schoolhouse in the middle of the jungle, basically. The only white person I would see would be Queen Elizabeth II looking down on us from above while we worked for years, for my whole childhood. And then I come to, and I used to feel a ways about it because in the classroom, we were always inspired to speak properly, which meant more white, more British, more like the Queen. And then, so I would resent it a bit. And of course, I go to Sioux Lookout, and Jonathan, what's the name of the high school in Sioux Lookout?
Queen Elizabeth, isn't it? I can't remember, but
Queen
yeah,
Elizabeth District High School.
I
So
think
when I
so.
walk
Yeah.
into the foyer, guess who's looking down at me from the foyer?
Yeah.
So I was aware of those connections. And then what I saw was people yelling at indigenous people in the streets while they're yelling derogatory things at indigenous people in the streets while they walk. People throwing things at indigenous people from cars as they were in the street. People uh talking because I wasn't indigenous, and those were the two groups. People kind of included me in whichever group I was with. So when I was with the white folks, you could hear them say, "Oh, we hate them, and they're terrible, and they're always drunk, and blah blah blah." And then when I was with the indigenous folks, I could hear stories of why they don't trust the white folks, and people getting beaten up, and people getting hurt, and people getting, the police like taking people and leaving them out in the cold and forcing them to walk home, risking their lives. And so it wasn't one thing, but it was all of that experience, which kind of hit me really hard because really there were only two sides and I didn't know which one I belonged on. But it was kind of like when you see one of your friends gossiping about a third friend, the natural thought is, well, what do they say about me when I'm not here? And
Yeah,
so
right.
when I saw how cruel the white folks were to the indigenous folks when they weren't there, I thought, oh, well, probably at some point they're going to say something about me because I'm also different. So that's how those allegiances broke down in my little 11, 12-year-old brain.
I found it a weird. I remember when I moved there, it was interesting and strange because the town I grew up in was called Stratton, and Google will tell you
Mhm.
there's 42 people in Stratton. Like it's a village.
Wow.
It's very small. Um, but the school, there was a Christian grade school there, was K to
Mhm.
8, and so that when the school was in session, the population doubled or tripled because they would bus people in from other reserves. And because it was a Christian school, they had this weirdly secured, strange funding to teach Ojibwe. And so as a
Ah,
third language. And so they would actually bus in all the kids from the reserve to this school because their
wow.
parents, you had this weird scenario, which I didn't realize at the time, but later, of course, I realized I put the pieces together. It's like you had a strange scenario where the residential school system, the Christians, the Catholics, whatever what I call them, had more or less taken away the Ojibwe language. So therefore, their parents of the kids that I knew didn't know how to speak Ojibwe. So they couldn't teach
Yeah.
the kids, many of them. And so they would send their kids to this Christian school to now gain back the language. And it was a very
Yes.
weird scenario. And I didn't really understand that at the time, although it became like clear at a certain point. But the other thing that was just odd about it was you'd see these kids at school all the time, but you'd never see them outside of school.
Yeah.
And if I wanted to play with them, I couldn't. And it was never explained to me like, well, those kids suck or whatever. We don't want you playing those indigenous kids. It was always just, well, they don't have a phone. So
Mhm.
you can't play with them because they don't have a phone. How are you going to call them? How are you going to, whatever, which of course is on some level the cover for the other thing. But I remember just being like as a kid, it was just sort of confusing to me, like why they're like
Mm.
you would see all these weird divisions, but they would never really be explained
Yeah.
necessarily. They would just be
Yeah.
there. And then of
Yeah.
course, you start to kind of, figure things out as time goes on. But initially, it just sort of is the way it is to a kid,
Yeah.
and
And
which is a
as
kind of insidious thing.
yeah, and as a kid, I mean, that's why I've always been, so interested in children caught up in history they don't understand, like Black Cherokee, where she's growing up and she's born into all this history and she's trying to, and it's confusing, but it's important to note what you just said that about the parents not knowing how to speak Ojibwe. And it's important to see from my point of view language was the battleground back in the Caribbean where it was like speak properly.
Yeah, that's what
So
makes me
part
think of.
part
Mm,
of the indoctrination is language, and then they took the Ojibwe from them. But also, speaking of James Joyce, if you go to Ireland, James Joyce's generation actually did not speak Irish very well. And now, when you go to Ireland, like I just did in June, you see the youngest generations actually having to teach their grandparents how to speak Irish because, again, they were told not to speak it. And of course, the thing all three of these places have in common is the Queen,
yeah.
the crown, or the British crown. And so it's an interesting thing how um, banning language creates a flowering of interest in language, which after that creates literature. Like literature in the Caribbean flowered. There's a whole indigenous wave of literature, and the Irish have always been very good at literature. And so it's interesting that stifling language is what a colonial power wants to do. And the people sort of being stifled always turn to language to somehow reclaim their story. And that was, again, just like you're saying, at the time I didn't see it that way, but now looking back I'm like, wow, all
But
those
that
patterns are right there to see.
and that stuff is very under the ground in this novel in certain ways too. Like I
Hmm.
remember thinking I was really interested in the playground scene where Ophelia, I forget who calls her, but one of the kids calls her a racial slur, and then the line is Ophelia had no idea what this word meant.
Yeah.
Because of course her grandmother has been sheltering her against precisely this kind of thing up
Yes.
until this point. And I remember like just thinking that was really interesting to just throw that sentence out. Ophelia had no idea what this word meant, but then you never follow up on it in an obvious,
Hmm.
clear way because she's in the scene, she's reacting to now to what's going on, as opposed to taking time out of the novel to kind of start digging into things thematically. It just sort of sits
Yeah.
there, and you have to kind of pick it up.
Yeah.
Um, it reminded me of it's the same technique that you see in The Road a lot by McCarthy, where there's one great
Yeah.
moment in The Road where the trees start falling over. And you realize, and it never explains why the trees are falling over, but you start to realize, of course, that the trees are all dead. It's snowed. There's too much weight on the trees.
Hmm.
Prior to this moment, you might not have realized the trees are all dead.
Hmm.
But now you can start piecing it together. And I think
Hmm.
there's a lot of weird writerly power in just sort of putting out this information that's a little it sort of that challenges the reader's assumptions. Like you assume in The Road when you're reading it that when it mentions the tree is alive because that's our experience of trees, but that's not what's happening in the book. And I
Hmm.
think the same. It's an interesting moment in your novel because I think it really grabs the. It can make you realize, oh, I'm making a not lot of assumptions about
Yeah.
this world or about this person and their experience. And, there's just moments in the novel where you sort of, without making a huge deal of it, you start just kind of calling out the assumptions in these sorts of
Yeah.
moments, which I think is really an interesting thing to do in a novel about these racial tensions.
Yeah, it's funny because I had similar moments as a kid coming from Trinidad where I a lot of things we assume about race, I just didn't know because I come from a place where, everybody's got dark skin, so it's not really a thing we think about a lot. And so I think what it shows is how this stuff is taught. We're not born like with these sort of ways of seeing each other. It's taught to us as we're born into situations. Like you say, it's insidious, like you said. And we just kind of learn it almost without anyone telling us. We just kind of learn that, this is kind of how it goes. Like I didn't know what was like in Saga Boy, I say there's a place called White, and it was always better. And that was a summary of my childhood experience with my Anglican school. No one ever said that to me, but in a lot of
Nice.
ways, they said it to me 10 different ways without saying it. And so I kind of wanted to mimic that experience of, and it's not just that. A lot of our lessons in childhood are taught to us without being taught to us. And so this kind of way of, oh, I'm not going to tell you what that means because we all know the ramifications of it. I just want to point out the fact that there's a point where we don't know what these words mean and we don't know what these concepts are. And then it's taught to us and then we take them for granted,
I would
and yeah.
I always talk about I always think I like moments like that because to me the novel is about um challenging assumptions, at a
Mhm.
certain core level. And it's about, trying to, in a certain way, do violence to a person's ideas, and sort of,
Mhm.
take their ideas and start breaking them down in a certain respect. And maybe, the reaction is they change their ideas. Maybe, they entrench their ideas. But regardless, there's a challenge to the received idea, which I think is artistically part of the novel and what it's good at. And so I'm always interested in moments like that where, there's just, it kind of starts pulling attention to this. This synesthesia, I think, works that way too. The fact that where,
Mm.
she has this point of view on things, which is counter to basically how the reader would typically see things. And then she starts to, but then herself is has to kind of remember, oh, not everyone sees things this way, and
Yeah.
especially in that scene that you were talking about, it becomes sort of there's an sort of an issue for a moment where she like remembers. There's like a disconnect between how the one character is viewing her and how she
Yeah.
imagining how she might see things, and it is it. I'm curious to just as a sort of as we wrap up here, if you could talk a little bit about just the technical challenge of writing synesthesia or writing a character with synesthesia.
I think first and foremost, I am immersive and sensual writer. Like we talked about the sense of sound and hearing, but I also always am thinking about all the senses. And so I wanted to write a character who for whom sight was not the primary sense. And her sense of um taste and smell are kind of the things that lead her. And that's why she's always cooking and she's always communicating through cooking. But also, so the synesthesia is just kind of a way to, again, challenge how we would typically experience the world. And so Ophelia experiences the world through when she goes to hearing and to sight, they're all jumbled up, especially when they come with a lot of emotion. It tends to pop up. And what that looks like is in that scene you're describing, she's walking with her friend, they're going to church, and she starts seeing like a cascade of colors in the sky. And her friend goes, "It's amazing, isn't it?" And she thinks her friend is seeing these colors as well, but actually her friend is seeing what's causing the colors, which is the sound of the music coming from the church. And she has this moment where she's like, "Oh yeah, it's beautiful, all these colors." And her friend's like, "What colors are you talking about?" "I'm talking about the music." And Ophelia has to go, "Oh yeah, people don't see sounds, but she sees sounds." And so technically what that looks like is anytime Ophelia is having an emotional moment, or anytime she's having a moment at all, we have to think about all the senses. And that sort of primes the reader for when she has a very emotional moment. Now we're going to take those senses and we're going to scramble them up. We're going to put them all in a bag, shake it up, and who knows which one she's going to pull out, right? And that's really, really great. I always think it's a great exercise to write a scene using one sense and then write it again using another, but ignoring that first sense. Because it gives you an immersive feel when you can have all your senses. And really great writers will move very elegantly from one sense to another, and suddenly you feel like you're in the moment because you're sensing it. With Ophelia, I want you to feel her isolation. I want you to feel how she can't even see something next to someone and get the same experience from it. It's a separate experience, it's a different experience, and it's an isolating experience for her because you can't even talk about how beautiful the music is because you're saying, well, it's pink and fuchsia, and they're saying, what do you mean? It's a sound. you know. So
Right.
you're now isolated in your experience. And so that's the what I'm using the synesthesia at in Black Cherokee. I'm constantly, but to set that up though, I have to always be, when Ophelia is directly experiencing something, I have to start with senses other than sight. And
Right.
so it'll be the breeze on her skin giving her goosebumps. It'll be the way something smells. It'll be the way um the sound, like you said, the sizzling sound of the pan, right? That is priming you from the beginning to think of Ophelia as a creature who works in senses that we don't typically focus on. Like we have all of those senses, but we don't usually lead with them. So in a way, I'm intentionally diminishing the primacy of sight. And then when it gets to these emotional moments, now I you're ready for me to sort of make touch or sight, or to scramble them a bit so that you can now get a sense of her in this sort of isolated space. And sometimes it's really beautiful, like when she sees the magnolia blossoms, when she meets Christopher later on in the book, that sense of being in this world where she's experiencing it in this flush, five-dimensional sensual place, and it feels really beautiful, I think. But that's also isolating, right? Because who else can feel this beauty with me, right? And so yeah, so that's kind of what I'm exploring with the synesthesia.
I really love the visual, the challenge to to the visual primacy, because it seems to me like the modern novel is so influenced visually. It's so wrapped up in visuals. It's so influenced by film, that
Mm.
it's interesting to me that your novel is sort of challenging that in that particular way. And I think it's a nice metaphor for what I feel the job of the novel is, which is exactly like you were saying about the synesthesia. To me, the novel should also itself be a challenge to how you experience the world. And so, it's been great talking to you, Antonio Michael Downing. Everybody should check out Black Cherokee, which I've got, I guess I can't show it on my little screen. So,
There it is.
and your other books. And of course, John Orpheus as well.
Thanks a lot, Jonathan. I appreciate connecting with you on music and avant-garde. And I love that you started with molasses because people often ignore molasses. But for me, it's almost like a philosopher's stone of my writing. Like everything that I've ever done, you can find a key to it in molasses. So thank you for that.
Thank you.